They tried to erase his voice before the world could hear it. They tried to break his mind before it could change history. Born into slavery, denied even the knowledge of his own birthday, Frederick Douglass was never meant to read, to write, or to think freely. In a nation built on chains, intelligence in a black man was considered dangerous, and Douglass was brilliant beyond control. Every word he learned became an act of rebellion. Every sentence he wrote struck fear into the very system that enslaved him. This is not just the story of a former slave. This is the story of a genius America tried to silence and failed. He entered the world already erased on paper. No birth certificate, no written proof of the day or year he first breathed, no official acknowledgement that his life had begun. Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in Maryland, and like millions of enslaved children, the moment of his birth was considered irrelevant to the system that claimed ownership over his body. Time itself was denied to him. While free children could one day look back and say who they were and when they began, enslaved children were deliberately kept suspended in uncertainty, their origins blurred so completely that even memory became a form of control. Douglass would later recall that he did not know his own birthday, and had no way to discover it. This absence was not accidental. Slaveholders avoided recording such details because knowledge created identity, and identity created resistance. To know one's age was to mark one's growth, to understand one's life as a progression rather than a condition. By stripping enslaved people of dates, the system stripped them of continuity, turning life into an endless present of labor and obedience. From his earliest years, Douglass understood that something fundamental had been taken from him before he could even speak. He learned early that white children knew their ages, and spoke of birthdays as moments of celebration, while enslaved children were expected not to ask such questions. Curiosity itself was treated as defiance. When Douglass asked older enslaved people about his birth, he found that none could tell him for certain. Their own lives had been subjected to the same erasure. Generations lived and died without markers, without anniversaries, without records, as though they existed outside of time. This collective uncertainty became one of Douglass's first lessons in how slavery worked, not only on the body but on memory and history. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was enslaved, and his father was likely a white man, possibly his owner, though this too was never officially acknowledged. The silence around his parentage deepened the sense that his life was deliberately obscure. In slavery, the origins of children like Douglass were often shrouded because clarity would expose violence, coercion, and exploitation. By keeping facts unspoken, the system protected its. Douglass grew up knowing that even the most basic truths about his own existence were considered dangerous. This uncertainty followed him into childhood. Without a birth date, milestones lost meaning. Age did not grant protection or privilege. A child could be treated as an adult when labor was required, yet denied adulthood when responsibility or recognition was involved. Douglass observed that enslaved children were aged up or down depending on convenience, their physical development used against them while their humanity was ignored. Not knowing his age meant he could not measure how long he had endured, only that endurance was expected to continue indefinitely. The lack of a recorded birth also symbolized something deeper. It reinforced the idea that enslaved people were not born but acquired. They entered the world not as individuals but as property. The absence of documentation made it easier for owners to sell, trade, or discard them without consequence. For Douglass, realizing this truth became one of his earliest awakenings to the cruelty of the system. His life from its very beginning had been treated as an asset rather than a human story. As he grew older, Douglass began to understand that this erasure was intentional and strategic. Slavery depended on confusion. If a person did not know where they began, it was harder for them to imagine an end. Not knowing his age meant not knowing how long he had been enslaved, or how long he might remain so. Time blurred into suffering, and suffering became normal. Yet even as a child, Douglass felt the injustice of this theft. The question of his birth lingered in his mind, quietly shaping his understanding of freedom long before he could name it. He would later write that white children could tell their ages, while enslaved children could not, and that this difference alone revealed the inequality at the heart of the nation. Something as simple as a birthday became a dividing line between freedom and bondage. Douglass did not simply envy the celebration, he recognized what it represented. To know one's birth was to be acknowledged as a person whose life mattered enough to be counted. The uncertainty surrounding his birth forced Douglass to construct identity in other ways. Deprived of official facts, he turned inward, observing, remembering, questioning. This inward attention became a foundation for his later intellectual power. The same mind that wondered about his beginnings would one day interrogate the moral contradictions of America itself. The absence of a birth record did not erase his sense of self, it sharpened it, turning lack into awareness. Yet as a child, the pain of not knowing was constant. It reminded him daily that he belonged to a world where even his arrival into life was unworthy of notice. The silence around his birth echoed the larger silence imposed on enslaved voices. They were not expected to speak, to remember, or to testify. Douglass would eventually break that silence. But first he had to live inside it, carrying the weight of an origin that had been deliberately denied. This denial shaped his earliest understanding of power. Whoever controlled records controlled reality. Whoever named dates decided whose lives were worth remembering. In a society that celebrated its own independence in history, millions lived without even the right to know when their own story began. Douglass's unknown birthday became one of his first proofs that slavery was not merely a system of labor, but a system of erasure designed to strip human beings of past, present, and future. Separation came so early that it felt almost natural, which was precisely the cruelty of it. Frederick Douglass was taken from his mother, Harriet Bailey, when he was still an infant, before memory could fully form, before attachment could solidify into something that might resist being torn apart. In the world of slavery, this separation was not an exception, but a calculated norm. Mothers were allowed to give birth, but they were not allowed to raise. Love was permitted only insofar as it did not interfere with labor, profit, or control. Douglass would later learn that this early separation was deliberate. Enslavers believed that breaking the bond between mother and child made both easier to manage. A child who did not grow up knowing a mother would have fewer emotional anchors, fewer loyalties beyond the plantation. A mother who did not raise her child would be less likely to resist, less likely to run, less likely to defy orders that threatened punishment. The system understood the power of family, and so it dismantled it before it could grow. His mother lived on a different plantation, miles away. She was forced to work long hours, leaving her little freedom to see her son. When she did come, it was usually at night. After exhausting days of labor, she would walk for hours through darkness just to sit beside him for a short time, often while he slept. Douglass remembered that she would arrive silently, hold him, and be gone again before dawn. These visits were rare, fragile, and fleeting, more like shadows than memories, but they left an imprint of longing that never faded. Because he was so young when they were separated, Douglass did not experience the loss as a single traumatic moment, but as an ongoing absence. There was no dramatic farewell, no final embrace. Instead, there was a quiet void where a mother should have. Other children were raised by their mothers, even within slavery, but Douglass was sent to live with his grandmother Betsy Bailey, who cared for many enslaved children. Though she provided what comfort she could, the absence of a mother was a wound that no substitute could fully heal. The system framed this arrangement as practical, even benevolent, but its true purpose was control. By preventing mothers from raising their own children, enslavers ensured that emotional bonds would not become sources of resistance. Love could inspire courage, sacrifice, and rebellion. A child who deeply loved a mother might dream of protecting her, or escaping with her. A mother who deeply loved a child might risk everything to keep them safe. Slavery could not afford such risks. Douglass grew up knowing his mother more as an idea than a presence. He knew she existed, knew her name, knew she cared enough to walk miles in the night to see him, but he did not know her voice well, her expressions, or her daily life. This partial knowledge created a painful contradiction. She was close enough to be real, yet distant enough to feel unreachable. That tension became one of the earliest emotional realities of his life. When Harriet Bailey died, Douglass was still a child. He was not present, he was not summoned, he was not given time to grieve. Her death was communicated to him without ceremony, as though it were a minor detail rather than the loss of a parent. He later reflected that he felt little immediate grief, not because he did not love her, but because the system had denied him the chance to form the kind of relationship that would allow grief to fully express itself. Slavery did not just steal family, it stole the language of mourning. This emotional numbness was itself a form of violence. By separating children from their mothers, slavery trained them to suppress feeling as a means of survival. Pain that could not be acknowledged had to be buried. Douglass would later recognize how deeply this early separation shaped his inner world, teaching him to observe rather than feel, to analyze rather than collapse. These traits would later serve him intellectually, but they were born from law. The separation also taught him a harsh lesson about power. It showed him that nothing, not even the bond between mother and child, was sacred under slavery. If such a fundamental relationship could be broken without consequence, then no aspect of life was safe. This realization eroded any illusion of security and replaced it with a constant awareness of vulnerability. From an early age, Douglass understood that his life was subject to forces that did not recognize love, kinship, or human need. Yet within this cruelty, there was also evidence of resistance. Harriet Bailey's nighttime journeys were acts of quiet defiance. Each step she took through darkness was a refusal to fully surrender her role as a mother. Though the system tried to erase their bond, she preserved it in fragments, in brief moments, stolen from exhaustion and fear. Douglass would later honor these acts, recognizing them as expressions of courage. In a world designed to crush such instinct, the separation shaped his understanding of injustice long before he could articulate it. He did not need philosophical arguments to know something was wrong. The emptiness where a mother should have been was proof enough. As he grew, this absence became a lens through which he viewed all forms of oppression. If a system could justify taking a child from his mother, it could justify anything. This early loss also influenced how Douglass viewed freedom. Freedom was not only the absence of chains, but the presence of family, choice, and belonging. The memory of being denied his mother became intertwined with his desire for a world where such separations were unthinkable. Long before he escaped slavery, the idea of freedom had already taken shape in his mind, as a restoration of what had been taken before he could remember, a reclaiming of bonds that slavery had tried to dissolve before they could fully form. From the moment Frederick Douglass became aware of the world around him, he sensed that knowledge itself was guarded like a weapon. Reading and writing were not neutral skills in the slave-holding South. They were forbidden doors, locked not by accident, but by law, custom and fear. Enslaved people were expected to work, obey, and forget, not to read words that might awaken questions. Douglass did not yet know the full reason, but he understood instinctively that the very act of learning carried danger. When he was sent to Baltimore to live with Hugh and Sophia Auld, his life briefly brushed against something rare. Sophia Auld, who had never owned a slave before, began teaching him the alphabet. At first her actions were gentle and unthinking. She saw a child eager to learn and responded with kindness, showing him letters and sounds as one might teach any other boy. For Douglass these moments felt electric. Letters were not just symbols, they were keys, and each one unlocked a piece of a world he had been denied. That fragile opening closed abruptly when Hugh Auld discovered what was happening. He reacted with anger and alarm, not because he feared Douglass would misuse the skill, but because he understood exactly what literacy meant. He declared that teaching a slave to read would ruin him, make him unfit to be a slave, and forever discontented with his condition. Those words burned themselves into Douglass's mind. In that single outburst, his master revealed the truth of the system more clearly than any sermon or punishment ever could. Sophia Auld never taught him again. Worse still, she began to change. Fear and custom reshaped her behavior, turning her from a kind teacher into a vigilant enforcer of ignorance. Douglass watched as the same hands that once guided his learning now snatched newspapers away and scolded him for curiosity. Slavery did not only enslave the body, it corrupted the spirit of those who upheld it. Douglass learned that the system could transform ordinary people into guardians of cruelty, but Hugh Auld's warning had an unintended effect. Instead of discouraging Douglass, it gave him clarity. If learning to read would make him unfit to be a slave, then literacy must be the path out of slavery. The forbidden nature of reading gave it power. From that moment on, Douglass associated knowledge with freedom and ignorance with chains. The ban itself became his teacher, pointing him toward resistance. Denied formal instruction, Douglass turned the world around him into a classroom. He befriended white children in the streets of Baltimore, trading bread for less. With each exchange he learned new letters, new words, new meanings. These children did not fully grasp the significance of what they were doing, but Douglass did. Every word he learned felt stolen back from a system designed to keep him silent. Hunger and learning became intertwined. As he sacrificed food to feed his mind, he practiced writing whenever he could, copying letters from shipyard markings, tracing words in dust, mimicking what he saw others do. Writing was harder than reading, because it required visible proof of knowledge. A written word could betray him. Still he persisted, knowing that to write was to assert existence, to leave a mark in a world that insisted he leave none. Each attempt carried risk, but risk was already a constant condition of his life. As his literacy grew, so did his awareness. Reading exposed him to ideas that disturbed and inflamed him. He encountered speeches, essays, and arguments about liberty and human rights that stood in violent contrast to his lived reality. Words that celebrated freedom mocked his condition, and this contradiction filled him with anguish. Literacy did not immediately bring comfort. It brought clarity, and clarity brought pain. He could now articulate the injustice he had always felt, but could not name. There were moments when he wished for ignorance, when the weight of understanding felt unbearable. To know that freedom was possible and denied was more torturous than not knowing at all. Yet even in despair, Douglass recognized that this pain was necessary. Awareness was the price of awakening. Literacy sharpened his suffering, but it also sharpened his resolve, transforming vague resentment into focused resistance. The prohibition against reading was enforced with threats and violence. Enslaved people caught with books risked severe punishment. This constant danger taught Douglass discipline and secrecy. Learning became an underground act, carried out in stolen moments, hidden corners and quiet determination. The need to hide his intellect trained him to observe, to plan, to wait, skills that would later prove essential in his escape and activism. Through reading,
Douglass also learned the language of power. He saw how words shaped laws, justified cruelty, and maintained illusions of morality. He learned that those who controlled language controlled narratives, and those who controlled narratives controlled reality. Literacy was not simply about personal freedom, it was about the ability to challenge lies with truth. This realization transformed reading from a personal act into a moral responsibility. The more he learned, the more dangerous he became to the system that enslaved him. A literate slave could question orders, interpret contracts, understand laws, and communicate ideas. Literacy threatened the very foundation of slavery, which depended on enforced ignorance. Douglass embodied that threat, even as a young boy, and the system responded by tightening its grip, increasing surveillance, and reinforcing prohibition. Yet no amount of restriction could undo what had already begun. Once Douglass understood letters, he could not unlearn them. Once he grasped the connection between knowledge and freedom, the idea could not be erased. Literacy reshaped his inner life, giving structure to his thoughts and direction to his anger. It allowed him to imagine himself not as property, but as a thinking being capable of shaping his own destiny. The ban on reading and writing meant to keep him powerless, instead revealed the system's greatest fear. It exposed the truth that slavery could not survive in the presence of an educated mind. Douglass carried this truth with him, hidden but alive, as every new word added weight to his understanding, as every sentence he deciphered pushed him further from the identity imposed upon him, as language.
Once Frederick Douglass understood that literacy was forbidden because it threatened slavery, learning transformed from curiosity into resistance. Every letter became an act of defiance, every word a quiet refusal to remain what the system demanded. He no longer saw reading and writing as simple skills but as weapons he would have to acquire in secret, through patience, deception, and relentless will. The more dangerous learning became, the more necessary it felt. He learned to hide his hunger for knowledge behind obedience. In the presence of enslavers, he appeared dutiful and silent, careful not to draw attention to his thoughts. Inside, his mind was constantly searching for opportunities. He memorized letters from signs, labels, and markings wherever he went. In shipyards, he studied the chalked initials on barrels and crates, repeating them silently until they fixed themselves in his memory. The world itself became a text, offering fragments of language to anyone determined enough to read it. Douglass refined the art of learning through exchange. He approached poor white boys in Baltimore not as a student begging for charity but as a negotiator. Bread was his currency. With food in his hand, he asked them to teach him new news, to correct his spelling, to explain what he did not understand. These interactions were brief and casual on the surface, but they carried immense risk. If discovered, he could be punished severely. Still, he returned again and again, knowing that knowledge was worth the danger. Writing required even greater secrecy. To write was to produce evidence, something that could not be erased as easily as spoken words. Douglass practiced by copying letters whenever he could do so unnoticed. He imitated handwriting from discarded papers, traced shapes in dirt, and repeated strokes until his hands learned what his mind already knew. Each attempt strengthened his sense of control over language. Even as he remained physically controlled by others, he turned competition into camouflage. By challenging white boys to writing contests, he disguised his learning as a game. When they mocked him for being unable to write as well as they could, he used their pride against them, prompting them to show him how to improve. What appeared to be harmless rivalry was, in truth, a calculated strategy. He learned to survive intellectually by understanding human behavior, exploiting arrogance, and concealing intention. The secrecy of his education shaped his discipline. Learning could not be casual or unfocused. He had to absorb information quickly, remember it precisely, and apply it without error. There was no room for distraction. This intensity sharpened his mind, teaching him concentration and endurance. Each stolen lesson demanded full attention because it might be the last for days or weeks. As his literacy grew, so did his sense of self. Writing his own thoughts, even in fragments, allowed him to see himself as more than property. The act of forming sentences affirmed his humanity. In a system designed to reduce him to labor, writing proved that he could think, reason, and create. This internal transformation was as significant as any external change. Long before he escaped physically, he had begun to free himself mentally. Yet this freedom came with emotional cost. Literacy deepened his awareness of injustice and intensified his suffering. He could now read about liberty, equality, and natural rights, concepts that mocked his daily reality. Secret learning did not bring immediate joy, it brought a painful clarity. Still, Douglass chose awareness over comfort. He understood that ignorance might dull pain but could never end it. The constant need for secrecy also trained him in caution. He learned to read people as carefully as texts, judging who could be trusted, who might betray him, who was simply indifferent. This skill would later prove essential as he navigated escape, public life, and political struggle. Learning in secret was not only about acquiring knowledge, it was about surviving in a hostile environment where exposure meant punishment. Douglass's self-education revealed a deeper truth about slavery. The system depended on the illusion that enslaved people were incapable of intellectual growth. His progress shattered that lie, even if only within his own mind. Each new word contradicted the ideology that justified his bondage. By teaching himself, he was not merely improving his condition, he was disproving the moral foundation of slavery itself. The danger of discovery never disappeared. At any moment, a misplaced paper, a careless word, or a suspicious glance could expose. This constant threat infused his learning with urgency. There was no guarantee of tomorrow's lesson, so today's had to count. Knowledge was gathered in pieces, assembled slowly into understanding, much like a map drawn without guidance. Through secret learning, Douglass also learned patience. Freedom would not come quickly or easily. It would require time, strategy, and resilience. Each word he mastered was a step forward, even if the distance to liberation still seemed vast. He began to see learning not as a single breakthrough but as a gradual accumulation, a quiet force building beneath the surface. By teaching himself to read and write under conditions designed to prevent it, Douglass asserted control over one of the few domains still available to him, his mind. This internal autonomy became the foundation for everything that followed. Literacy gave him the tools to question authority, to articulate injustice, and eventually to speak with a voice powerful enough to challenge a nation. All of it beginning in secrecy, sustained by determination driven by the understanding that knowledge itself was a form of rebellion unfolding in silence. The moment Frederick Douglass connected knowledge to freedom, the world shifted from something endured to something analyzed. Learning was no longer just an act of defiance or survival. It became a direction, a path leading somewhere beyond the immediate suffering of slavery. He began to understand that chains were not only made of iron but of ignorance, and that breaking one without breaking the other would never be enough. This realization settled into him slowly, shaped by experience, observation, and painful clarity. As he read more, Douglass saw how power operated through information. Slaveholders understood laws, contracts, and systems that enslaved people were deliberately kept from comprehending. Knowledge created asymmetry. It allowed one group to command and another to obey. Douglass recognized that as long as he remained ignorant, he would always be at the mercy of those who claimed ownership over him. Literacy did not merely offer personal satisfaction, it offered leverage. Reading exposed him to the language of rights and liberty, concepts that were celebrated publicly, yet denied privately to millions. These ideas were not abstract to Douglass. They were measurements against which his life could be judged. Every sentence about freedom sharpened his sense of injustice. He saw that slavery depended on a contradiction, so large it could only survive through silence and suppression. Knowledge threatened that silence, yet this understanding came with torment. The more clearly Douglass saw the injustice of his condition, the more unbearable it became. Ignorance had once offered a kind of dull refuge. Awareness stripped that refuge away. He now knew that his suffering was not natural, not inevitable, but imposed and maintained by human choice. This knowledge filled him with anger, despair, and longing, emotions that often collided within him. There were times when Douglass felt knowledge had made him miserable rather than free. He described moments of wishing he had remained ignorant, of envying those who could endure slavery without constantly measuring it against ideals of liberty. But even in these moments, he understood that ignorance could never truly protect him. It could numb pain but not remove its cause. Knowledge might wound, but it also illuminated the possibility of healing. As his understanding deepened, Douglass began to see himself differently. He was no longer simply a victim of circumstance, but a thinker capable of judgment. This shift in self-perception was crucial. Freedom first appeared not as an external event, but as an internal state. To see oneself as entitled to liberty was the first step toward demanding it. Knowledge gave him that entitlement, rooted not in law but in moral truth. He also began to understand why slaveholders feared educated enslaved people. An informed mind could question commands, interpret intentions, and recognize deception. Knowledge reduced the psychological distance between enslaved and free, undermining the hierarchy that slavery required. Douglass saw that education flattened artificial distinctions, exposing the system's reliance on force rather than legitimacy. This realization reshaped his ambitions. Freedom was no longer a vague dream but a concrete goal tied to preparation. Knowledge would equip him to navigate the dangers of escape, to understand geography, to read signs, to interpret opportunities. It would also prepare him for life beyond slavery, a life where survival required more than physical strength. Education became a form of readiness, a way to ensure that freedom, if achieved, could be sustained. Douglass's growing awareness also sharpened his sense of time. He began to see his life not as an endless present of labor, but as a sequence with a potential future. Knowledge allowed him to imagine himself older, changed, free. This ability to project himself forward was itself an act of resistance. Slavery sought to trap people in a perpetual now, denying them past and future. Education restored both. He learned that freedom demanded more than escape. It demanded understanding. Without knowledge, a free person could still be exploited, deceived, or silenced. Douglass recognized that true liberation required the ability to speak, argue, and persuade. The mind had to be as unchained as the body. This insight would later guide his life as an orator and writer, but it began here, in quiet reflection and painful awareness. Knowledge also connected him to others. Through reading, he encountered voices that named injustices he had lived but never articulated. These voices made his suffering legible, transforming isolation into shared experience. He realized that slavery was not just his personal burden, but a systemic wrong that could be confronted collectively. Education turned private pain into public understanding. This connection deepened his resolve. Freedom was no longer only about himself, but about challenging a system that denied humanity to millions. Knowledge gave him responsibility as well as power. To know the truth was to carry it, to eventually speak it, even when doing so invited danger. Douglass began to see his learning not as a selfish pursuit, but as preparation for a larger struggle. As the link between knowledge and freedom solidified, Douglass's patience thinned. Awareness made obedience feel increasingly impossible. Each command reminded him of the contradiction between what he knew and what he was forced to do. This tension created inner conflict, but also momentum. Knowledge pushed him forward, refusing to let him settle back into acceptance. By recognizing knowledge as the path from slavery to freedom, Douglass transformed education into purpose. Learning was no longer incidental, it was essential. It shaped his decisions, sharpened his resistance, and redefined his sense of self. The journey toward freedom had begun long before his physical escape, rooted in the understanding that liberation starts in the mind, grows through awareness, and demands the courage to act on what one knows. Brutality was not hidden in Frederick Douglass's world. It was instruction. When he was sent to Edward Covey, a man infamous for breaking the spirits of enslaved people, the purpose was clear even if it was never spoken aloud. Covey was known as a slave breaker, someone who specialized in crushing resistance, reshaping human beings into silent tools through fear, exhaustion, and constant surveillance. Douglass was sent to him not because he had committed a crime, but because his intelligence and growing independence were seen as threats that needed correction. From the moment he arrived, Covey asserted control through relentless labor. Douglass was worked from before dawn until after sunset, driven far beyond the limits of endurance. The goal was not productivity alone but domination. Exhaustion was a weapon. A body pushed to its limits had little energy left for thought, and Covey understood that breaking the mind required first breaking the body. Under this regime, Douglass felt his strength diminish day by day, his confidence eroded by unending toil. Violence was constant and unpredictable. Covey beat Douglass not always for mistakes, but often without clear reason. This randomness was deliberate. Punishment without logic taught submission more effectively than punishment tied to rules. If there was no way to avoid pain, then obedience became instinctual rather than reason. Douglass learned that Covey's cruelty was calculated, designed to keep enslaved people in a state of perpetual anxiety. Covey also used deception as a tool. He presented himself as deeply religious, quoting scripture while committing acts of extreme violence. This hypocrisy disturbed Douglass deeply. It revealed how moral language could be twisted to justify cruelty, how faith could be weaponized to sanctify oppression. Watching Covey pray and then beat enslaved people shattered any illusion that religion alone guaranteed virtue. The psychological toll was immense. Douglass later described this period as one where the spark within him nearly went out. He felt himself becoming what the system wanted: obedient, hopeless, diminished. The intellectual fire that had been fueled by learning flickered under the weight of constant abuse. There were moments when he believed Covey might succeed, when the vision of freedom seemed distant and unrealistic. Covey's control extended beyond physical punishment. He spied constantly, appearing suddenly in fields or woods to catch enslaved people at rest.
This surveillance created the feeling that escape was impossible, that even private thoughts were unsafe. Douglass learned that domination was as much about presence as punishment. Covey's unseen eyes were meant to live in the minds of those he controlled. The breaking process reached a critical point when Douglass collapsed from exhaustion and illness. Rather than showing concern, Covey beat him again, reinforcing the idea that weakness was not tolerated. In that moment, Douglass felt reduced to something less than human, valued only for output and punished for limitation. The system had no space for mercy. Yet within this degradation something unexpected began to stir. The extremity of Covey's cruelty clarified the nature of the struggle. This was no misunderstanding, no harsh discipline meant to improve behavior. It was a deliberate attempt to erase identity. Recognizing this sharpened Douglass's inner conflict. Submission promised survival, but at the cost of selfhood. The turning point came when Douglass resolved that he could not allow himself to be broken, even if resistance meant greater danger. When Covey attempted to whip him again, Douglass resisted physically. The struggle that followed was intense and prolonged. For 2 hours they fought, not as master and slave, but as two men locked in conflict. Douglass did not win in a conventional sense, but he did not submit. This act of resistance transformed him. Though Covey did not beat him again, the greater change was internal. Douglass felt a renewed sense of dignity, a recovery of the manhood that Covey had tried to strip away. The fight restored his belief in himself, proving that the spirit could resist even when the body was constrained. Fear lost its absolute power. The experience with Covey taught Douglass that brutality was not merely about pain, it was about psychology. Breaking enslaved people required convincing them that resistance was futile and dangerous. By resisting and surviving, Douglass disrupted that narrative within himself. He learned that power was not as absolute as it appeared, that even a slave breaker relied on the compliance of those he sought to dominate. This period also deepened Douglass's understanding of slavery as a system, rather than a collection of cruel individuals. Covey was not an anomaly but a function. His role existed because the institution required men willing to do such work. The violence Douglass endured was not personal, it was structural, designed to maintain an economy and social order built on dehumanization. The scars of this time never fully faded. The physical pain, the humiliation, the exhaustion left lasting marks, but they also forged resilience. Douglass emerged with a clear understanding of what freedom would require, not only escape, but the refusal to accept definitions imposed by violence. Covey failed to break him completely, and in that failure Douglass found proof that the system was vulnerable, that domination depended on fear, and that fear.
After the confrontation with Edward Covey, something fundamental shifted within Frederick Douglass. The struggle had not ended slavery, nor had it changed his legal status, but it had altered the way he saw himself. For the first time since childhood, he no longer felt entirely defined by submission. The act of resisting, of refusing to be whipped, restored a sense of manhood that had been systematically stripped away. This internal change marked a turning point that no chain or law could reverse. Douglass realized that fear had been Covey's greatest weapon. The violence, the surveillance, the unpredictability were all designed to convince enslaved people that resistance was pointless. By standing up to Covey and surviving, Douglass broke that illusion within himself. He learned that obedience was not natural or inevitable. It was enforced through terror. Once that terror was confronted, its power diminished. The realization did not make him reckless, but it made him aware of his own capacity to endure confrontation. This shift in self-image affected how he carried himself. He stood differently, spoke differently, and thought differently. Even when outwardly compliant, his inner posture had changed. He was no longer simply reacting to commands but evaluating them. This mental distance from his oppressor created space for autonomy. Even within confinement, the difference was subtle but profound, transforming his experience of slavery from passive suffering to conscious endurance. The restoration of self-respect also revived his intellectual hunger. The despair that had dulled his mind under Covey's abuse began to lift. He felt again the urgency of learning, the importance of preparation. The fight had proven that resistance was possible, but knowledge would be required to make resistance effective. His earlier insight that education was the path to freedom returned with renewed force, now anchored in lived experience rather than theory. Douglass also became more observant of power dynamics around him. He noticed how other enslaved people responded to authority, how fear shaped behavior, and how small acts of defiance could ripple through a community. His own resistance had consequences beyond himself, altering how Covey treated others and how they saw the possibility of standing up. This awareness deepened his sense of responsibility, even as it heightened the risks he faced. The experience taught him that physical resistance and moral resistance were connected. To believe oneself worthy of dignity was to challenge the logic of slavery at its core. Douglass understood that the system relied on internalized inferiority as much as external force. Once an enslaved person rejected that inferiority, even silently, the system's grip weakened. This insight became central to his later arguments against slavery. Yet the change within him was not without conflict. Resistance brought danger, and Douglass knew that open defiance could lead to severe punishment or death. He had to balance his renewed sense of self with caution. The lesson was not that one should always fight physically, but that one should never surrender mentally. Survival required strategy as much as courage. This internal transformation also reshaped his understanding of freedom. Freedom was no longer only about legal status or physical escape. It was about self-ownership. To claim oneself as a thinking, feeling, deserving human being was itself a form of liberation. Even in chains, Douglass began to experience moments of psychological freedom rooted in self-respect. The restored self-image influenced how he related to others. He became more confident in conversation, more willing to express opinions, more aware of his own worth. These changes did not go unnoticed. Enslavers often sensed when someone was no longer broken, and that awareness could provoke harsher treatment. Douglass learned to mask his inner freedom when necessary, understanding that discretion was essential to survive. At the same time, the fight with Covey had planted a seed that could not be buried. It showed him that slavery depended on consent extracted through violence, and that when that consent faltered, the system revealed its fragility. This knowledge gave him patience. He no longer saw himself as trapped forever, but as temporarily constrained, waiting for the right moment. The transformation also sharpened his moral clarity. He no longer doubted that slavery was evil, or that resistance was justified. The ambiguity that sometimes clouds those born into oppression gave way to certainty. His experience had proven that the system sought not improvement or order, but domination. Rejecting that domination became a moral imperative rather than a reckless impulse. As Douglass carried this new self-image forward, it influenced every decision he made. Each act of obedience was now strategic rather than submissive. Each silence was calculated rather than imposed. He began to live with a dual awareness, outwardly enslaved, inwardly free. This duality was exhausting but empowering, providing a foundation for the boldness that would later define his escape and his voice. The fight with Covey did not end Douglass's suffering, but it ended his acceptance of being broken. It marked the moment when he reclaimed ownership over his identity, when he proved to himself that his spirit could resist even the most determined efforts to crush it. From that point on, slavery could control his body, but it could no longer fully command his sense of self. And that internal victory became the quiet engine driving him toward the freedom he now knew was possible. The idea of escape did not arrive suddenly in Frederick Douglass's mind. It grew slowly, shaped by fear, hope, observation, and relentless calculation. Once his sense of self had been restored, the thought of remaining enslaved became increasingly unbearable. Freedom was no longer an abstract dream but a necessity tied to survival of the spirit. Yet knowing that escape was possible did not make it simple. Every road, every face, every sound, carried the threat of capture, punishment, or death. Douglass understood that escape required secrecy above all else. To speak of it openly was to invite betrayal, intentional or accidental. Enslaved people lived under constant pressure, and fear could loosen tongues. Slave catchers relied on informants, rewards, and terror to prevent escape. Douglass learned to guard his thoughts carefully, revealing nothing even to those he trusted. Silence became a form of protection. He studied the geography around him with new intensity. Roads, rivers, railways, and ports became more than features of the landscape. They became potential routes to freedom. He paid attention to direction, distance, and movement, noting how goods and people traveled. This awareness transformed ordinary surroundings into a mental map, one that might one day guide him beyond bondage. Disguises and papers became part of his calculations. Douglass understood that the border between slavery and freedom was not only physical but bureaucratic. A black man traveling alone was immediately suspect. Freedom required the appearance of legitimacy. He observed how free black sailors moved, how they spoke, how they carried themselves. These observations were lessons in survival, teaching him how freedom was performed as much as claimed. The risk of capture was constant and overwhelming. Fugitive slave laws empowered authorities and private citizens alike to seize escaped enslaved people and return them for reward. Capture meant brutal punishment, sale to harsher conditions, or permanent separation from anyone he knew. Douglass weighed these consequences carefully, knowing that one mistake could erase all future possibility. Despite the danger, the pull of freedom grew stronger than fear. Remaining enslaved meant a slow death of the spirit, a life constrained by others. Escape offered uncertainty, but also possibility. Douglass began to accept that danger was unavoidable. Whether he stayed or fled, the difference lay in purpose. Risk taken for freedom felt different from suffering endured without hope. Trust became one of the most difficult challenges. Escape often required assistance, yet assistance could not be demanded. It had to be earned and tested. Douglass learned to read people closely, listening more than speaking, noting who showed sympathy, who showed indifference, and who showed hostility. Each interaction carried potential consequence. One wrong judgment could lead to betrayal. He also had to confront the emotional cost of escape. Leaving meant separation from those still enslaved, abandoning relationships forged in suffering. Guilt and fear of reprisal haunted him. Slaveholders often punished those left behind when someone escaped, using collective suffering as deterrence. Douglass carried the weight of this knowledge, understanding that his freedom might bring pain to others. The act of planning itself became an exercise in discipline. He had to restrain impatience, waiting for the right moment rather than acting on impulse. Freedom required timing as much as courage. Each delay tested his resolve, forcing him to live with anticipation and restraint. This waiting sharpened his focus, teaching him endurance of a different kind. Douglass also recognized that escape was not simply a physical journey but a transformation of identity. Once he fled, he would no longer be a known quantity. He would have to navigate a world that was hostile, suspicious, and dangerous for a black man claiming freedom. Escape meant entering uncertainty without guarantee of safety or success. As plans took shape, his awareness of surveillance intensified. He noticed how closely enslavers watched movements, how patrols operated, how rumors spread. Every routine could become a trap. Douglass learned to appear ordinary, to blend into expected patterns, hiding extraordinary intention beneath compliance. This performance required constant attention, a double life lived under pressure. The closer escape came to reality, the heavier the emotional strain grew. Hope and fear coexisted uneasily. He imagined success and failure with equal clarity, rehearsing both outcomes in his mind. This mental preparation was a form of armor, helping him face whatever might come without paralysis. Escape also forced Douglass to confront the meaning of freedom itself. Freedom would not erase hardship, racism, or danger. It would offer responsibility without protection, choice without safety net. Yet even these challenges felt preferable to bondage. Freedom meant ownership of risk, the right to fail on one's own terms. When the moment finally approached, it carried no drama, only intensity. Every sound felt louder, every movement heavier with consequence. Ordinary actions took on new meaning. A step forward was irreversible. Doubt pressed in but resolve held. The knowledge he had gained, the self-respect he had reclaimed, and the awareness he had cultivated converged into action. The journey itself was a test of nerve and adaptability. Each encounter required quick judgment. Each delay threatened exposure. Douglass relied on the discipline forged through years of secrecy and observation. He understood that freedom was not granted at a single boundary, but earned moment by moment through careful decision-making. Throughout the ordeal, the threat of capture never fully disappeared. Even as distance grew, danger followed. Slave catchers operated far from plantations, and suspicion shadowed every step. Freedom was fragile, easily revoked by a single accusation. Douglass learned that escape was not an end but a beginning of vigilance. The experience of fleeing slavery permanently altered his understanding of courage. Courage was not absence of fear, but movement through it. Every choice he made carried risk, yet each step forward affirmed his claim to himself. Escape demanded the full measure of his intellect, discipline, and resolve, drawing on every lesson he had learned in bondage, every insight gained through suffering, and every fragment of hope sustained through years of preparation, under the constant shadow of capture. Once Frederick Douglass had escaped the physical bonds of slavery, the challenge of transforming his experience into a voice for change became his central mission. Freedom was not simply the absence of chains, it was the ability to speak, to reason, and to challenge the system that had sought to destroy him. Douglass recognized that slavery had relied on silencing intellect and expression as much as it had relied on physical control. To survive outside bondage was not enough. He had to assert himself publicly, to reclaim his narrative and confront the lies that justified oppression. The first step in this transformation was understanding the power of his own story. Douglass knew that personal testimony could pierce denials and abstractions, that recounting lived experience could make the moral and practical failures of slavery undeniable. He realized that words could do what physical resistance could not: awaken empathy, provoke outrage, and galvanize action. His voice, once forbidden, became his most potent weapon, capable of reaching thousands who might never witness the cruelty first. He also recognized that the story must be more than simple recounting. It had to be strategic,
Douglass carefully considered how to frame events, which details to emphasize, and how to reveal injustice in a way that could not be dismissed. He understood that slaveholders had shaped narratives to normalize oppression, to depict enslaved people as unfit for freedom, and to cast resistance as dangerous or unnatural. Countering this required intellect, precision and courage. Each sentence had to carry moral weight and factual clarity, exposing the contradictions of a nation that claimed liberty while denying it to millions. Public speaking became a natural extension of this strategy. Douglass understood that oratory was a tool to transform knowledge into action. His speeches were not only informative, but performative, designed to engage emotion, sharpen reasoning, and compel reflection. He employed cadence, repetition, and vivid imagery to convey the brutality he had endured, ensuring that listeners could not ignore the reality of slavery, even if they had never witnessed it themselves. Speaking publicly demanded a confrontation with danger. Abolitionist voices were threatened, attacked and silenced, yet Douglass accepted these risks because the alternative silence would perpetuate oppression. The process of turning lived experience into public testimony required introspection and self-discipline. Douglass needed to reconcile anger with strategy, trauma with clarity, and memory with narrative structure. Each retelling demanded honesty without self-indulgence, emotional depth without losing focus, and moral outrage without alienating potential allies. This balancing act was as challenging as any physical trial, requiring him to master his own voice as rigorously as he had mastered reading and writing under slavery. Douglass also realized the importance of education in his advocacy. Knowledge gained through literacy became the foundation of his arguments. He could quote laws, analyze economic systems, and expose political hypocrisy with precision. Intellectual preparation transformed him from a former enslaved person into a credible critic of the entire institution of slavery. His personal experience alone provoked sympathy, but combined with reasoned analysis, it created irrefutable authority. He demonstrated that the mind of an enslaved person, once liberated, could match and surpass those who had claimed superiority. This work demanded courage in new form. The threats were no longer immediate physical punishment, but social, political, and legal retaliation. Douglass risked attacks from mobs, slander from opponents, and capture under the Fugitive Slave Act. Each appearance, each lecture, each publication was an act of calculated risk. He had to remain vigilant, understanding that freedom outside slavery still required negotiation with danger. Yet the threat of risk reinforced the stakes, compelling him to articulate truth with even greater precision and urgency. Douglass also recognized the importance of audience. He tailored his message to various listeners, understanding that persuasion required empathy and adaptation. He spoke to Northern reformers to awaken conscience, to abolitionist societies to mobilize action, and to formerly enslaved people to inspire hope and solidarity. Each group required different emphasis, different examples, and different appeals to morality, logic, and emotion. Mastering this art allowed him to extend influence far beyond what he could achieve through individual storytelling alone. The challenge of advocacy also demanded resilience. Douglass faced skepticism and dismissal from some quarters, even in free states. Some could not believe the depth of his suffering. Others questioned the credibility of a black man speaking against systemic injustice. Each rebuke tested his resolve, yet he drew strength from the knowledge that truth itself was a force. Facts could be disputed temporarily, but with consistent articulation and evidence, reality could prevail. Persistence became a form of power, building credibility and influence over time. Furthermore, Douglass's public voice carried ethical responsibility. He was aware that misrepresentation, exaggeration, or omission could undermine the entire abolitionist cause. Accuracy was not simply a personal virtue, but a strategic necessity. Each word, each anecdote, each argument was scrutinized. Douglass learned to present his story in ways that honored his experience, while advancing the broader moral and political fight. This disciplined approach elevated his credibility, and ensured that his testimony could not be easily dismissed as mere emotion or anecdote. Finally, Douglass understood that his advocacy was part of a larger movement. He was not alone, but his unique voice lent clarity and urgency to the struggle. His ability to articulate the moral, social, and political dimensions of slavery provided a model for others to follow. By transforming personal experience into public testimony, he demonstrated the power of narrative, intellect, and courage in challenging systemic oppression. This approach became a cornerstone of his life's work, enabling him to influence policy, mobilize communities.
The journey of Frederick Douglass from enslavement to intellectual and moral authority culminated in a life dedicated to advocacy, reform, and the relentless pursuit of justice. His escape had freed his body, but the real struggle and the greater triumph lay in transforming his experiences into power that could challenge the very institution that had sought to destroy him. Douglass understood that the fight against slavery was not only physical but ideological, and that true influence required mastery over language, narrative, and public perception. From the earliest stages of his self-education, Douglass recognized that knowledge was a pathway to freedom. Reading and writing had allowed him to analyze his oppression, see its structures, and imagine a life beyond chains. After escape, he expanded this intellectual rigor into public engagement. He became a master of rhetoric, able to connect personal suffering with universal principles of justice. He understood that his life story was not merely anecdotal but emblematic of the systemic brutality of slavery, and he wielded it with precision to awaken conscience and inspire action. Writing became a central tool in his struggle. Douglass's autobiographies were revolutionary not only for their vivid depiction of the horrors of slavery, but also for the clarity of their moral argument. He meticulously documented events, interactions, and abuses, presenting them in ways that could not be dismissed as exaggeration or fiction. His words bridged the gap between personal narrative and political critique, revealing slavery as both an economic system and a profound moral failure. The act of recording his experiences was itself an assertion of agency, reclaiming voice from a system that had sought to silence him. Public speaking was equally transformative. Douglass recognized the power of presence and performance. His speeches combined factual recounting with moral and philosophical reasoning, designed to engage both heart and mind. He could evoke empathy through the horrors he described while simultaneously appealing to logic and justice. Audiences were compelled to confront contradictions between American ideals and the realities of slavery, and many who had been passive or indifferent were stirred into awareness and activism. Douglass's ability to communicate across diverse audiences made him one of the most influential voices of his time. The stakes of this advocacy were immense. Douglass risked attack from pro-slavery mobs, legal repercussions under the Fugitive Slave Act, and constant surveillance. Yet he accepted these dangers because he understood that silence was complicity. Every lecture, every publication, every debate was a calculated act of defiance, a demonstration that intellectual and moral courage could confront even entrenched systems of oppression. His personal risk amplified the moral authority of his message, showing that commitment to justice required both intellect and bravery. Douglass's work also highlighted the intersection of slavery with broader societal structure. He analyzed the legal, economic, and political mechanisms that sustained oppression, exposing how laws, commerce, and ideology intertwined to maintain control. By situating personal narrative within structural critique, he educated audiences on the systemic nature of slavery, countering simplistic notions that it was merely a series of isolated abuses. This approach elevated his advocacy from testimony to comprehensive argumentation, influencing policy debates and public opinion. Education and empowerment were central to Douglass's vision. He believed that freedom required more than physical release. It demanded the tools to navigate a society structured to marginalize Black people. Literacy, critical thinking, and public engagement were not luxuries but necessity. By demonstrating the intellectual capacities of formerly enslaved people, he challenged pervasive racist ideologies that justified oppression. Douglass's own life became evidence that intelligence and moral judgment were not determined by race, and this truth undermined the moral foundation of slavery. His advocacy extended beyond abolition. Douglass recognized that freedom must include civil rights, political participation, and social equality. He argued for suffrage, legal protection, and educational opportunity, understanding that without these, liberation would remain incomplete. His voice influenced legislation, public opinion, and grassroots movements, bridging gaps between personal narrative, moral philosophy, and practical action. He exemplified how lived experience could inform strategy, policy, and vision for societal transformation. The ethical rigor of Douglass's work was also central. He meticulously avoided exaggeration, ensuring that his accounts were credible and persuasive. Accuracy was a moral as well as strategic necessity. Misrepresentation would not only harm his own cause but could be exploited by opponents to dismiss the broader abolitionist movement. Douglass's discipline in documentation, argumentation, and public engagement reinforced his authority, creating a model for principled advocacy that combined moral conviction with intellectual rigor. Douglass's life demonstrated the interdependence of individual action and collective struggle. While his voice was singularly powerful, he understood that systemic change required alliances, networks, and coordinated effort. He worked with other abolitionists, reformers, and activists, providing leadership while amplifying collective goals. His ability to balance personal prominence with commitment to larger movements enhanced the effectiveness of both his own advocacy and the wider struggle for justice. Even after the abolition of slavery, Douglass continued to fight for equality, recognizing that liberation was a process rather than a moment. He addressed issues of racial discrimination, education, political representation, and economic opportunity, understanding that the end of formal bondage did not end oppression. His voice remained a moral compass, insisting that freedom required continuous vigilance, advocacy, and engagement. By situating his work within a long-term vision, he demonstrated that justice is sustained through persistent effort, not temporary triumphs. Throughout his life, Douglass exemplified the transformation of suffering into power. His experiences under slavery, deprivation, brutality, forced labor, and systemic erasure became the foundation for extraordinary intellectual, moral, and strategic achievement. He converted trauma into testimony, observation into argument, and resistance into leadership. Each step of his journey reinforced the principle that true freedom required the reclamation of self, the mastery of knowledge, and the courage to act on conscience. Ultimately, Douglass's genius lay in his ability to integrate personal experience, intellectual rigor, moral clarity, and strategic action. He understood the dynamics of oppression, the mechanics of resistance, and the power of narrative. His life demonstrated that escaping physical chains was only the beginning. Shaping society, influencing thought, and confronting injustice required persistence, courage, and vision. Through his writings, speeches, and activism, he redefined what it meant to be free and showed that one individual's intellect and determination could challenge even the most entrenched systems of domination. Frederick Douglass's life is a testament to the unbreakable power of the human spirit. He transformed the tools of oppression into instruments of liberation, showing that knowledge, courage, and moral clarity could overcome even the most brutal systems of control. From a child torn from his mother, denied education, and subjected to relentless violence, he rose to become one of the most influential voices in the fight against slavery and injustice. His journey proves that freedom is not given. It is claimed, nurtured, and defended through relentless effort and unwavering conviction. Douglass's story is more than history. It is a blueprint for resistance, a reminder that intellect and courage are inseparable in the pursuit of justice, and an enduring inspiration that even in the face of oppression,